The Bible starts out with the story of the creation of the world, and it speaks of God speaking everything into creation, forming humans and breathing the breath of life into us. And God creates this beautiful garden in which humans can flourish in relationship with God. There are parameters set in place, and you know what happens. We humans decide that we want to be like God, and we decide we want to know what God knows. So the first humans ignore God's commandments and are punished for it. They are put outside of the garden. The relationship with God is harmed, and God spends the rest of the story trying to set things right. But it wasn't just the relationships with God and humans that is broken. The relationship between humans themselves quickly take a difficult turn as well. After we learn of the creation, we then learn of the story of Adam and Eve and their sons Cain and Abel. And again, if you have grown up in the church, you know their story. Cain is a farmer, tilling, planting, working the ground. Abel is a hunter. They each bring sacrifices before God, and for some reason, Abel's sacrifice is interpreted as more pleasing to God, and Cain can't stand it. God tries to remind Cain that if he offers his best, he will be regarded just as Abel was. He isn't any less loved than Abel. And then God goes so far as to warn Cain that this jealousy he is feeling, even if he hasn't offered his best to God, is like sin lurking at the door. It desires him, and it will take him over if he doesn't master it. What is going on inside of Cain will burst from inside him and have serious repercussions as it spills over into life through actual actions. And sure enough, Cain is so enraged by the experience that he lashes out in anger and kills his own brother. And eventually God confronts Cain. "Where is your brother Abel?" God asks him, certainly knowing full well what had happened. And here Cain responds with a question that has puzzled humanity ever since it was first recorded. Cain asks God, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Now jump on over to the first book of the New Testament, the Gospel of Matthew, and we find Jesus teaching his disciples and the crowds that are listening in as they sit on the side of a mountain. He is trying to give them a clear understanding of what life is like on God's terms in God's realm. Jesus is initiating the kingdom of God right then and there among them. And it is that kingdom, not the kingdoms of this world, into which he wants them to live. They have to be different and act differently than the rest of the world. One of the lessons is essentially that in God's realm, in God's kingdom, we live in relationship with all of those around us. Everyone is our brother and sister, and what we do and say to them matters. In a way, we are their keepers, and they are ours. These relationships define everything about us, and living in the right way requires deeper self-examination than most people are willing to undertake. It requires a righteousness greater than even the scribes or the Pharisees, Jesus says, and recognizing the role the inner life plays in the outer life of our actions helps us have some understanding of what it means for us to live as followers of Jesus Christ, who was himself the very fulfillment of the law and the commandments. This is what Jesus says to them from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, verses 21 through 37. "You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment.' But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you are liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, 'You fool,' you will be liable to the hell of fire. So when you are offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or your sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are on the way to court with him, or your accuser will hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you will be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny." Jesus went on to say to them, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to go into hell. Then again he said to them, it was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that anyone who divorces his wife, except on the grounds of unchastity, causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery with her. Again, you have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, you shall not swear falsely, but carry out the vows you have made to the Lord. But I say to you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let your word be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything more than this comes from the evil one. Now, someone once said, when someone shows you who they are, believe them. And this saying may be profoundly true when it comes to us as people of the Christian faith. They say that actions speak louder than words, and if we profess to be Christians, then what we say and do speaks volumes about our theology. Our actions and our words reveal exactly what we believe about God. We live in community with one another. None of us is truly and completely alone in this world. Our actions, whether we realize it or not, or whether we like it or not, impact those around us. On the one hand, this can be truly comforting, truly good news to us. We're never alone. There are others who love us and care for us, even if we don't know it. But on the other hand, it also comes with great responsibility. Our actions always have some consequence on us as well as on others. It may be on the people with whom we live in closest proximity, our spouses, our children, our parents. It may be on people with whom we live in community of faith, like our church family, or simply in community like our neighbors next door. It may be on our coworkers, or it may even be on people that we do not know, have never met, and may never meet. But what we do impacts them because of how we spend our time, our energy, and our money. Now, this is nothing new. Read through the writings of the speeches and the writings of the Old Testament prophets, and there are many different times when they offer condemnation to the people of Israel on behalf of God. And it is based on the way that the Israelites have treated each other. It is especially true when they have treated the poor, the widowed, the orphaned, with disrespect and oppression. The prophet Micah reminds the people that they know how to please the Lord. They simply have to work for justice. They have to love mercy. They have to walk humbly with God. And then the prophet Isaiah says that the fast and sacrifice God desires from the people is to loose the bonds of the oppressed, to undo the ties of the yoke upon the people's backs, and to let the oppressed go free, to feed the hungry, to house the homeless. And then they will be like light breaking forth at dawn. Their love of God and what they believe about God and the ways they worship God are tied to the ways they live each day and the ways that they act on behalf of those around them. And then Jesus is tying everything he is telling his disciples back to the tradition that is far more ancient than them. He's already told them that he is not changing the law or replacing it. In fact, he's fulfilling it. He's intensifying their understanding of it. He is saying that the law and commandments, if they are lived out as he teaches them, have transformative power upon us. They transform us from the inside out. We may have originally heard them as purely external, but it starts on the inside. It's easy enough for us to hear a commandment that says, "You shall not kill." And sure, we may have heard someone say something like, "I was so mad I could have killed him." But only on the rarest of occasions would any of us actually take that as a real threat. Now, unfortunately, people continue to be killed every day, And each life taken before its time is a tragedy and breaks God's heart. But only the smallest percentage of people you and I know would ever truly consider taking another person's life, and even fewer would actually go through with it. Still, Jesus intensifies the requirements for everyone. It isn't just about the actual act of taking someone's life. Obviously, that will bring judgment from the court of law and from God, but so will the anger that you hold inside of you for someone else. Anger, if left unchecked, can have serious and irreparable impacts on your life and your outlook on the world and on the way that you relate to someone else. If you are not careful, the anger will become what controls you and drives your actions, especially actions against someone else. You will end up insulting them. You will end up working to spite them. You will end up, as Jesus says, calling them a fool. It is this place where I think Jesus' warning carries serious weight for us today. This anger that we hold inside of us, that comes out in so many different ways, is so detrimental to us because it causes us to lose sight of the fact that we are living in God's realm of relationship. And this anger causes us to lose sight of the very humanity and the very divine image that binds us to those with whom we are found in relationship. Just the other night, as I was winding down and preparing to go to bed, I did what most of us do today. I checked my phone, which meant that I looked at least briefly at the news feeds on all of the social media accounts that I have. I got on Twitter specifically, and I'm not exaggerating when I say that 9 out of 10 tweets could be covered by this first admonition from Jesus in this section of the Sermon on the Mount. They were angry at someone or something. And sure, some of them, perhaps many of them, might have been justified in their anger. But if you look through the threads for these different people in their accounts, anger is one of the clearest driving forces. Now, I know that justified anger at the wrongs of this world has led to some of the most productive action and most needed changes in our world. But the anger can quickly move from expressions of righteous indignation and outrage at the horrors of this world and shift into another area that Jesus covers, insulting the brothers and sisters with whom we live in this world. Constantly, this anger at someone or something, usually these days someone or something with whom we disagree, spills over into name-calling. And underneath all of it is this sense of how foolish we think other people are. Now, when Jesus addresses calling people fools here, he isn't simply talking about looking at what someone does and thinking, oh, what a lovable idiot. It isn't even about looking at someone who does something that is so outlandish to us that we can't even believe it. It just seems downright stupid. And this isn't even as simple as our parents teaching us that we shouldn't even call people stupid because it's impolite, or if you don't have anything nice to say, then you should just not say anything at all. No, it goes even deeper to one of our greatest issues today. With all of the division we have in this world, with all of the polarization, with simply listening to the way that different news outlets cover the events of the day and realizing that it is almost as if people are living on different planets with the way they view the world. Our issue is not simply disagreement. Our issue is disgust. The nature of our world right now is such that we are likely on one side of an issue and someone around us is on the other side. There is such cognitive dissonance between the two positions and perspectives that we cannot imagine how the other person can hold that view or act in that way. And guess what? They feel the same way about us. But we don't just disagree with one another. We are somehow disgusted by each other. We want to have absolutely nothing to do with the other person because our disgust has caused us to have a complete disregard for their basic humanity. Take, for example, an issue like wearing a mask to prevent the spread of the COVID-19 virus. It is something that many wouldn't think of as a polarizing issue, but like almost everything today, it is. On one side, you have people who are wearing a mask, and they are doing so out of some reason, and they are disgusted by those who choose not to, so disgusted that they might find themselves saying, I can't believe they won't just wear a mask. I hope they get the virus and die. it would serve them right. On the other side, you have people who believe the virus is not a threat to them, so in their minds, they have no reason to wear a mask. It's just their choice, or not. I actually heard a story last week where someone was in a store, and the person at the counter was not wearing a mask, and the patron was. They politely commented how they wished that the employee would simply follow a different set of guidelines. According to the account, the worker literally looked at the patron and said, "I don't care if you die." Now, regardless of where you stand on this issue, neither of these internal perspectives is good. Our anger and our disgust with the people on the other side of this issue, or any issue today for that matter, is causing us to completely disregard the divine image held within our fellow human beings. Our anger, that not dealt with, leads to disgust, then leads to a disregard of the divine image in others, not only hurts our relationship with those around us in obvious ways, but it also hurts our relationship with God. Jesus says that reconciliation in these situations is so important that it actually takes precedence over worship. And he doesn't say it lightly. He's talking to a group of disciples and a crowd listening in that are in Galilee, a good 3-day journey from the temple in Jerusalem. When he speaks of making sacrifices at the altar, that's the altar he means. He basically says, imagine that you have already made a 3-day journey to Jerusalem. You are worshiping in the temple. You have your sacrifice, and it's your turn to hand it over to the priest and to say your prayers, to be blessed, and to worship. And then all of a sudden, you realize that you have a grudge against someone, or they have a grudge against you. There is some broken relationship in your life. And with that broken relationship, it is simply impossible for you to fully worship God with a pure heart. You ought to just leave the animal there, which would certainly have been ridiculous, because who's going to look after it for you while you're gone? But he then says you should walk back to your home, even if it takes 3 more days. Spend whatever time is necessary to reconcile with the other person, then walk the other 3 days back to Jerusalem, and then worship. It sounds absurd, sure, but at least then you will be able to worship God with a clear heart and a clear conscience. Our relationship with others are so important to God, and the anger inside of us has such destructive power that Jesus would prefer that we work for reconciliation instead of gathering with the community for worship. It makes sense later on when we hear Jesus say that the greatest commandments in God's realm are loving God and loving others, and the two are tied together. You can't fully love God until you are loving your neighbor as yourself. And if something comes between you, then you need to take care of it. And when he tells the disciples that they need to pray for forgiveness, they need to remember that the forgiveness that God would give them is tied to the forgiveness that they give others. In God's realm, in God's kingdom, in God's family, the two relationships are tied together. And a broken relationship with those around us breaks our relationship with God as well. One scholar actually pointed out that the responsibility for reconciliation falls upon the party that realizes the break in the relationship. We tend to think that it would always be the responsibility of the offending party to seek reconciliation. But Jesus seems to say it's the responsibility of the one who recognizes the break first. Sometimes if someone has offended us or hurt us, they might not even know it. And that hurt sinks within us and leads to destructive anger. And at that point, when we know that the relationship has been broken, we should go to that person, even if, and especially if, they are unaware that they hurt us, and we should seek reconciliation. And obviously, yes, if we realize that we have hurt someone on purpose or not, if we are going to be in right relationship with God, we should work to reconcile with that other person as well. True freedom from the pain and the quarrels only comes when people are reconciled to one another and are thereby reconciled to God. Then Jesus moves from murder and anger to adultery and lust. And again, this goes to the direct commandment first. According to the law, sex is a gift from God that is designed for those within covenant with one another. Why? Well, sex is rarely as casual as we would like to think it could be. Emotions are always involved. People can always be hurt. Children come along. In ancient times, women were especially vulnerable to this. In many cases, their value and worth was seen in the purity that they held and their ability to bear children. Now, I'd pray that we would know better than that today, but in that time, for a woman to be used and then discarded meant that she could be in very serious trouble of being unable to fend for and provide for herself. It was a way of devaluing women and using them. And this was not God's intention. God's intention was mutuality and covenant in which both parties thrive. That is virtually impossible when the covenant is broken. Still, most of us would never dream of crossing that line, or at least that is what we believe about ourselves. But it can and does happen. It often starts with something on the inside, a thought, before it ever gets to the outside. It starts with lust, then moves to a seemingly harmless flirtation, and then a flirtation that ends up being much more than harmless. Then it may turn into a relationship that seems to fill something within a person that should be filled in the right relationship with the spouse, and then sex, and then brokenness that needs reconciliation. Anyone who's ever been hurt or found themselves in a broken relationship as a result of something like this knows how traumatic it can be. And no matter how our covenantal status, lust, like anger, causes us to devalue the humanity of someone else. Now, we all have angry thoughts. We all have lustful thoughts. And some say it goes to whether or not we linger and meditate on them, or whether or not we use them for pleasure in some way. To do so turns the other person into an object of our own pleasure instead of someone created in God's own image. It simply causes you to see that person, whether you know them personally or see them in real life or simply see them as images on a screen, as less than human. It denies the fact that you are bound together with that person in relationship, a God-given relationship, simply by being created in the same image of God. That person is your sister or brother, and God desires better of us than that. It is our responsibility to look at those around us with full value and worth and as fully human, just as we would hope that they would look at us. Someone said that it goes beyond doing to someone how you would wish that they would do to you. That's the golden rule, and they call it the platinum rule. It's looking at someone or doing to someone as they wish you would do to them because they are human. Anything that objectifies another human prohibits our ability to be in relationship with them in the way that God would desire. So Jesus used his prophetic hyperbolic language here to demonstrate how seriously he takes this relationship. He says that this should be a clear mark of the kingdom, and that for us to deny them would be better for us to tear out our own eye or to cut off a limb. And he does the same with the divorce, which he seems to leave some room for, but he also recognized the pattern of the men of that day of simply discarding women for any reason as if they were an object that they were done playing with. This was not God's way. And as well, when dealing with the second commandment of taking the Lord's name in vain, because in that day you could almost trace everything by which people swore to something to do with God. So he says, don't tarnish that name. Just tell the truth. Live with integrity. Do what you say you're going to do. Treat people with respect. Live so that you can be trusted and there will be no need for swearing or anything else. These aren't just lists of rules to be followed. This is what it looks like to flourish in this life. And if I'm going to flourish according to Christ, then I must flourish in my relationships with those around me as well. That is the kind of community Christ was initiating. It was about relationships that transform us from the inside out. It lays out a path that leads to abundance and wholeness of life for all people. And only by living differently than the culture around us will God's justice be done for all people. Only by living as examples of righteousness, mercy, and humility will the world around us be able to see the kingdom that God is forming through a Spirit-led community based in the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Christ himself. Theologian Scott Hosey says it like this: the point is that the law of God was meant to foster human flourishing at every level, including at the deepest levels of our hearts and minds. God wants us to respect each other, to love each other, to see God's own image residing deep within one another. Human life, he says, is not supposed to be some giant game in which you scheme and scam to get ahead for old number one. We are not to use people as pawns, as objects of our lust, as receptacles of our scorn, as the targets of our desires to brutalize, manipulate, and then discard. And it's not enough, he says, that all of this does not show up on the outside of our behavior. Hypocrisy is everything it is cracked up to be, and sooner or later, he says, it has a way of brutalizing the hypocrite too. Yes, no one would deny that the external actions have obviously more destructive impacts on those around us, at least immediately. But by going deeper, by moving beyond the obvious checklist to what resides in our heart, Jesus nails all of us. These are the things that go on inside all of us. And like it was with Cain, unless we find ways to master them, they will destroy us. It may seem impossible, but Jesus offers grace to us. And he offers us the key to life. He never turned himself to anger and vengeance that wasn't justified. He always saw those around him as children of God, worthy of God's love and grace. He never objectified anyone, but showed us time and again how each person could be part of initiating the kingdom of God. And Jesus believes in our ability to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world if we will live life in the ways he would desire of us. This is the daily struggle of faith. Recognize the life to which Jesus calls us. It is a flourishing life. It is a life built in relationships that would enable everyone around us to flourish as well. It is a life that reveals the abundant nature of God's realm for all people. But there are also parts deep within us that fight against that every day. They threaten us to turn us against one another, and therefore against God. And we must learn to master them and live according to Christ's way. Instead of anger and objectification, because of the grace of Christ, we can choose the ways of reconciliation and love. We can accept the relationships with our neighbors that God desires of us. And with Christ's help, we can thrive together. This is God's desire for the world. We can give the world a glimpse of it today. It is something we all desperately need.